In today's gospel, we meet Cleopas and his friend on the way to Emmaus. And they are properly armored. I'm talking about samurai armor. I'm talking about medieval, armor. They are clanking away towards Emmaus. Now, why do I say this? You hear it in their story, right? You hear the sadness in how they explain to this stranger everything that's happened, right? That they had gone there, all the way from Emmaus, they had gone there to see Jesus. This person that they had put their hope on. This person that they had hoped would be the Messiah, and as they said, would redeem Israel. This person that preached in ways that transformed their lives. They had put their hope in him. And right before their eyes, their leaders took him, handed him over to the Romans, and they saw him being crucified. And I can just imagine them saying, "That's it. Put it all back on." That little hope that they put when they took off some of that armor to let Jesus' words in, they were like, "No, put it back on, and let's go back home." And you see them literally going back home, going back to their routine, to their way of life, to their old job, back to the way things were. Because how silly of us, how foolish of us to think that the world could be different. And so as they were clanking away along the way, right, they were properly armored, right? They didn't want to let any more light in, right? And it's funny, I didn't test this before the sermon. I can barely see anything with these things. But that's how they were. They could barely see anything, right? And as they're walking along, this stranger shows up and asks, what they're talking about. And they get upset. "What do you mean, what are we talking about? Are you the only one who doesn't know what just happened?" And what I love about this gospel story are the details. Luke goes into a lot of detail to let us know the time and the day and what's happening all around. It begins by saying, on the same day. On which day? Resurrection Sunday, right? On the same day. In the morning, the women had gone to the tomb, and then here it is the afternoon, and they're walking back. So it's on resurrection morning. And they had just gotten up to go home. They got everything ready. They're on their way home. And then this stranger shows up. And when the stranger hears this, says, "You're right, you are foolish. But not because you believed in this Jesus, not because you let him in, not because you took your armor off. You're foolish because from the very beginning it has told that this is the way that it had to be." And then Jesus begins to remind them the story. And I use the word remind intentionally because they already know the story. In fact, they know the whole story, right? Because they heard from the women that Jesus was risen. They heard from the women that the tomb was empty. They heard from the women that they had seen visions of angels. So they know the story. They know how it ends. But they have too much armor on. They have too much armor on to see. And so Jesus begins to remind them the story, from Moses to the prophets to now. And again, I love Luke's details. They stopped because it was getting late. It was almost the evening. And it was too dangerous to be walking by themselves. It was about to get dark. So they stopped. And as Jesus was going to keep walking on, they said, no, join us. You barely have any armor on. You're just walking around like no one got crucified recently. Come on in. Stay with us and stay safe. And so Jesus comes in with them. And as they're getting ready for dinner, just as in the Last Supper, Jesus takes the bread and breaks it. And in that moment, their eyes were opened, and they saw Jesus there. And Jesus has vanished. And then they said, oh, we felt our hearts on fire, didn't we? When Jesus was talking to us? And then something happens, a miracle happens. It says, at that same hour, they got up and they went back to Jerusalem. Remember, they were there on purpose. It was unsafe. It was dark. But knowing that they had just seen Jesus, those things didn't matter anymore. They got up, and even though it was dark, they went to Jerusalem. Even though it was unsafe, they ran to Jerusalem. Even though it would have been unpolite to knock at the door in the middle of the night, the news was too important. They went back to Jerusalem. Even though they feared that no one would believe them, it didn't matter. They got up and went back to Jerusalem that same hour. They were no longer clanking anymore. They left behind their armor so that they can run fast enough to tell the news that Jesus was alive and had shown up to them. Friends, like I said in the beginning, we too have armor, right? We too put on armor to get through the day. You know, I can only speak for myself, but I certainly do. From the things that I wear to the things that I do, even sometimes the smile on my face is armor. To just project that everything's okay. To protect my heart from getting hurt. But the problem with armor is that just as it protects you and keeps things from hurting you, it also doesn't let the good things in either. It doesn't differentiate between those things that feed us, those things that heal us, those things that bring new life. And in today's gospel, Jesus is inviting us to dare to put down some of that armor so that Jesus can show up in our hearts in unexpected ways. This week, I read a story about this man named Jason that when he was younger, when he had just graduated from high school, he felt lost and made some friends that weren't the best influence. And in time, he would just spend all his time with them drinking, and in time they got bored and they started to do, silly things around the town, spray painting things, breaking things. And over time, to make money, they started to steal things. And he just went along with them. And then one day, they decided there was a university in their town, and they said, you know what probably can get us a lot of money? They have a laboratory in there. And I bet if we steal all that stuff, we can sell it and make tons of money. And so Jason said, let's do it. And they went in and broke in and started to steal all the stuff that wasn't bolted down in the lab. Well, in time, security came, and then the police came, and they were arrested. And Jason found himself, for the very first time, in a prison cell. And he writes that he felt like he had hit rock bottom. He felt that there was no redeeming from the moment that he was in right now. There was no way he could get his life back. There was no way that he could get out of this situation, and that there was no hope for him. And in that moment, he heard a voice. Hey, hey. It wasn't Jesus. He heard a voice, and it was coming from the vent on his cell. And he went over and said, yeah? And it was another inmate. And the other inmate yelled, whispered over through the vent, is this the first time you're in jail? Immediately, he put on the armor, right? Oh my God, they're going to hurt me, they're going to attack me, But then he thought, it can't get any worse than this. So he decided to be honest. And he said, yeah, it's my first time. And the inmate next to him said, I'm sorry. Can I pray for you? Now, Jason was not a religious person, and he probably went to church a handful of times. But for whatever reason, he said, yeah, sure. And through the air vent, that inmate prayed for Jason. And Jason writes that he wishes he could remember what the words were to that prayer. But he knows that in that moment, when he felt his lowest, when he felt surrounded by darkness, that prayer settled in his heart. And he dared to hope again. He ended up getting out. He ended up leaving those friends behind. He ended up applying to that same school he stole from and getting in. He ended up having this new life afterwards, where he writes that his life is very full and so different from what he thought his life could be so long ago. And in today's gospel, Jesus invites us to let go of some of that armor, to let Jesus' story settle in. And that sometimes that is hard. And even if we know the story by heart, sometimes it's hard to let that story rest in our hearts. But Jesus is there, and Jesus shows up. And Jesus invites us to not be afraid anymore. That if someone could be risen from the dead, then for God all things are possible. Jesus invites us to get up and run out just as we are and share the news that God's love has redeemed us all. Amen.